The ocean stretched like a sheet of black glass, broken only by faint rolling swells and the distant rumble of naval guns echoing from Kolombangara's shadowed outline. It was August 17th, 1943, 23:45 hours. The night air hung heavy with diesel fumes, sweat, and the metallic tang of salt. Even far from land, the jungle heat pressed down mercilessly, and every surface reeked of mildew and burnt powder. A few weak stars flickered behind drifting clouds, while the moon had disappeared completely, swallowed by the smoke of earlier bombardments. Every shadow seemed alive. Every shape could mean death. PT-117 sliced through the darkness like a narrow wooden blade. Its engines, throttled to near silence, coughed sporadically as seawater gurgled through the corroded exhaust ports. The 80-foot boat was an aging relic, built from mahogany, patched with resin, and barely holding together after 14 exhausting patrols in 6 weeks. Most of the crew carried burns or shrapnel scars from earlier runs. 2 of them were newcomers, still too inexperienced to realize how quickly the sea could turn fatal. At the helm stood Lieutenant Commander William Buck Taylor, 26 years old, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights, one hand bound in oil-soaked gauze. His fingers throbbed where the flames had stripped away skin the day before. He hadn't spoken for 10 long minutes. He didn't have to. Every man aboard could feel the tension vibrating through the deck plates, that sense that something different was coming, something worse, maybe something final. The mission had sounded simple. Patrol the Ferguson Passage. Intercept any Japanese convoy attempting to slip through. Intelligence hinted at destroyers, possibly more. But there was no air cover, no submarine support. Just 3 boats, PT-117, PT-119, and PT-132, creeping blindly through enemy waters. Their radar was dead, shorted out by salt corrosion and a frayed cable. They relied on compasses, fragments of starlight, and dead reckoning. Every 50 yards felt like a mile deeper into danger. From the bow came a whisper. "Sir, bearing 145. Fast wake. No lights." Rodriguez's voice barely cut through the wind. Taylor didn't answer. He lifted his binoculars, the lenses scuffed from weeks of spray, and scanned the horizon. A shadow emerged. Tall, sharp-edged, and moving fast. Then another. Then a third. Japanese destroyers, sailing in line formation, racing westward. Their wakes shimmered like oil slicks under faint starlight. They weren't hiding. They were charging toward the island. Taylor's grip tightened on the bridge rail. They were no longer hunters. They were the hunted. He lowered the binoculars. Battle stations. Cut starboard engine. Drift in. The words struck like a physical blow. The crew sprang into motion, stripping away loose gear, covering any reflective metal. The twin machine guns were rotated manually into firing position. Their last torpedo was rolled forward, its steel surface slick with condensation. The destroyers were closing fast, maybe 1,000 yards out, maybe less. Their guns stayed silent. No spotlights swept the waves. The Japanese still believed the passage was clear. PT-117's low, jagged profile blended perfectly with the crests of dark water. If they kept still, they might survive unseen. But if one man moved wrong, sneezed, coughed, prayed too loud, they'd be erased in an instant. Taylor knelt beside the torpedo mount. The locking lever had jammed the day before. He tested it again, still stiff. Adjusting the tube's angle by hand, he exhaled slowly through clenched teeth. Behind him, Ensign Miller watched the enemy silhouettes glide closer, his face pale, eyes wide and unblinking. Then the wind shifted. Smoke from Kolombangara drifted across the channel, cutting visibility. But the noise grew. The churn of engines, the slicing whine of propellers through water. At 200 yards, the last destroyer edged out of formation. Its spotlight flickered, hesitated. Taylor didn't wait. He whispered one word. Fire. The torpedo shuddered, then surged forward with a hiss, disappearing beneath the black waves. A silent spear aimed at steel hulls and sleeping men, and for a heartbeat, the entire world went still. The blast did not thunder. It cracked like a whip. A flat, chest-crushing concussion tore the surface apart in a blinding bloom of orange and searing white. Water heaved upward in great sheets. The shock waves slammed PT-117 broadside, rattling every beam and forcing the crew to their knees. No one spoke. No one celebrated. They braced for the counterstrike, for the full fury of Japanese guns to split them open like a matchbox. But it never came. Through the rising steam and spray, they saw the sight that stole breath, a towering pillar of flame bursting from the lead destroyer's midsection. Her hull kinked and buckled as steel screamed, then a secondary blast tore away her bow. The noise that followed was the high metallic wail of a dying warship, engines still howling, searchlights jerking, sailors screaming and voices swallowed by flame. She slewed to starboard and slammed into the second ship astern, sending showers of sparks and black smoke as steel kissed steel. Taylor did not pause. "Hard port! Get us out!" The boat groaned as the engine coughed back to life, belching smoke and heat. Rodriguez opened short, controlled bursts from the 50 cals to discourage any searchlight operators. Miller ducked behind the turret, reloading by feel in the dark. They were not attacking now. They were running, low, fast, trailing a black stain across a suddenly blinded sea. But the last destroyer had not been hit. She spun hard, smoothed her course, and brought all 3 searchlights to bear together. PT-117 was caught halfway through a turn. The beams cut through them like knives, brutal white light searing down the deck. Every man froze as the night went incandescent. Then the big guns opened. Not small automatic weapons, but full naval rounds from triple turrets, screaming over water and punching through empty air. One splashed 20 feet to port. The water plume drenched the gunner. Another detonated close to their wake, coating the engine deck in flaming spray. Shrapnel ripped into the cabin roof. Wooden splinters and blood spat across the helm. Taylor dropped beside the wheel and hauled Miller down with him. "Smoke, now!" Ensign Parker yanked the release. A dense chemical fog erupted from the rear canister and swallowed their wake. The engine hiccuped. They had maybe 30 seconds to disappear. Behind them, the sea burned like a forge. The 2 crippled destroyers continued to belch flame, one starting to list while the other reversed blindly toward the shallows. Radio silence held. Taylor would not broadcast. He refused to give away their position or confess what they had done. PT-117 zigzagged into deeper dark and slipped behind a jagged reef Taylor had memorized weeks earlier. The hull scraped coral as they threaded the narrow gap, wood groaning with each swell. They killed the engine again. Silence fell, punctured only by the hiss of steam and distant Japanese shouting over loudspeakers. Miller's hands trembled as he wiped blood from his sleeve. That wasn't supposed to happen." Taylor said nothing. His mind was already elsewhere, running through enemy dispositions, replaying the turning circle of a Fubuki class, counting torpedoes across the squadron. Only one remained, and it wasn't on his boat. He gazed toward the horizon. PT-119 had not checked in. PT-132 was nowhere to be seen. Out there, other destroyers might be closing in or falling back to regroup. In any case, PT-117 had given itself away. They were no longer ghosts. They were a target. At last, the radio man spoke. "Command's not answering. Jamming?" Taylor nodded, meaning perhaps something worse. Command simply wasn't listening. The crew huddled low, soaked with oil, blood, and fear. The burning ships behind them lit the sky like phantom pyres. Ahead of them stretched only the black night. Taylor pulled the chart from his waterproof satchel, opened it across the gun mount, and jabbed a trembling finger at a course. "We're not finished." His voice was small but absolute, and no one misunderstood his intent. He was going after the last destroyer, alone, with one engine and not a single torpedo left aboard his own boat. Smoke from the ruined ships drifted low across the sea, thick and slow like burning tar. Taylor leaned heavily against the bridge rail, eyes narrowed, tracking the rhythm of the waves as if they might reveal something. Every so often, a muted boom rolled in from the distance, the sound of dying destroyers surrendering to the ocean one piece at a time. The soft metallic groans of their breaking hulls mixed strangely with the sharp whine of insects that had followed the chaos out from shore. The air reeked of salt, fuel, and blistered paint, the scent of victory tangled with death in a single suffocating fog. PT-117 was just barely staying afloat. The hull had cracked near the stern, leaking steadily through swollen, warped boards that moaned under each swell. The engine wheezed black smoke, its valves hissing weakly like wounded snakes. Rodriguez worked silently, stuffing torn rags soaked in resin into bullet holes. The entire crew moved quietly now, not from discipline, but from that shared understanding of how razor-thin the line was between surviving and disappearing. Taylor's thoughts would not rest. He ran the fight back through his mind. The stealthy approach, the silence of the drift, the range at launch, the firing angle. That torpedo hadn't been luck. It had been precision. He'd caught it in the way the destroyer's wake distorted the shimmer on the water. That idea had first come to him 2 weeks before, after a failed ambush where the enemy had heard their engines. He'd realized sound moved differently through warm night air. So he'd tried something new, throttling down early, letting the enemy's own noise mask his boat. It worked once. Command called it reckless. He called it invisible. That tactic broke every rule. Without the engine, the boat was defenseless. No escape route, no adjustments, no noise cover if spotted. But under the right conditions, calm sea, steady wind, and the right current, the boat could disappear entirely. Drift forward like a ghost. Not even the water would whisper. Now, watching the distant fires fade into a dull orange haze, Taylor knew he'd need that trick again. The last destroyer was still out there. He could feel it, like a hunter circling in the dark, waiting. He gathered the men. Their faces were ash-gray from exhaustion, streaked with soot and sweat. "One torpedo left," he said quietly. "PT-119's out. They'll never expect us to strike again tonight." No one spoke, until Rodriguez gave a slow, deliberate nod. That was all they needed. They salvaged what remained, cleared the fuel lines, lubricated the torpedo rails with oily grime scraped from the bilge. The compass was cracked, so Taylor ordered navigation by stars, though most were hidden behind smoke. The radio man peeled wire from the signal system and turned it into a makeshift firing circuit, one last shot at control. They turned the bow back toward the faint mechanical hum, the steady churn of a destroyer's turbines drifting across the water. PT-117 went completely dark, every glint of metal covered with cloth or soot. Even the men's dog tags were wrapped in tape so they wouldn't clink. The boat faded into the darkness, a shape inside deeper shadow, gliding across a sea lit only by burning wreckage. Taylor throttled back until the screws spun almost silently. The boat began to drift, pulled by momentum and nothing more. No one dared to breathe too loudly, as if even air might betray them. The surface of the ocean shimmered like molten lead, flat and slick. Up ahead, a searchlight blinked on, then quickly vanished. Taylor leaned over and adjusted the torpedo by hand. The metal chilled his fingertips. His bandaged palm throbbed, but he didn't stop. His instincts screamed that they were dangerously close. and still not close enough. He gave a whisper-soft command. "Hold steady." The wind stopped. The sea went still. Then, through the darkness, the deep thrum of spinning screws returned. Near, heavy, unmistakable. The destroyer was circling back, sweeping for survivors. Her engines beat like a slow drum against the hull of the drifting PT boat. Taylor waited, motionless, until he saw it. The faint ripple of her bow slicing through the glowing phosphorescent water. He aligned the tube toward the glow, and aimed. The destroyer rose like a wall of steel against the pitch-black horizon. Its massive shape blotted out what little glow remained from distant fires, casting the water beneath it into an inky void. Taylor's breathing slowed to a crawl. Every noise seemed amplified. The groan of the torpedo mount, the faint slap of waves against the hull, the muted jingle of a wrench in someone's pocket. The crew stood frozen, locked in a silence so deep it didn't feel natural. Only the steady hum of the Japanese destroyer's turbines filled the night, vibrating softly through the sea like a heartbeat. PT-117 had drifted within 400 yards. A death zone. One wrong movement, a single glimmer of reflection, and they'd be nothing but a memory. Taylor's injured hand clenched around the release lever. Sweat stung his eyes, but he didn't dare blink. The destroyer's forward lights flared briefly, sweeping the wreckage nearby, then went dark once more. It was tracking by sound, not sight. The moment was set. "Now," Taylor murmured. The last torpedo slid free and vanished beneath the surface with a soft hiss, leaving only shimmering ripples behind. The boat rocked slightly, the wooden hull groaning under the recoil. Taylor counted in his head. 3, 6, 9. Then the sea ahead erupted in a blast of white fire. A pillar of flame shot skyward, tearing the calm to pieces. The destroyer's center lifted clear of the water before crashing down violently. A wave of debris fanned outward, pieces hissing as they hit the sea. A deep, metallic wail followed, the sound of a giant breaking apart. Fire rolled along the deck, its reflection spreading across the water like glowing glass. Voices shouted in Japanese, some running for the rails, others leaping into the flames. The guns never fired. The ship was gone before they had a chance to react. Taylor's crew stood stunned, unable to speak. They had seen ships burn before, but never this close, never so suddenly. For just a moment, the explosion's light illuminated their faces. Fatigue, shock, fear. Then the darkness returned and swallowed them whole. Embers and fragments floated past, brushing the hull as they drifted. "Engines," Taylor said softly. The mechanic paused, listening to the damage. One spark plug had been blown by the blast's pressure, and fire leaked from the exhaust pipe. Rodriguez dumped seawater over it, steam hissing around his boots. The sharp scent of salt and scorched oil filled the air. The engine sputtered, caught, then roared unevenly. The boat lurched forward, moving through a trail of burning slick. Behind them, the destroyer began to capsize. Its bow lifted once more, glowing red as ammunition exploded below. A string of secondary blasts followed, loud and rhythmic. Then, with a low groan, the ship sank beneath the surface, leaving behind only churning flames and a field of rising bubbles. Taylor didn't turn to watch her go. His focus stayed locked on the night ahead. The radio remained silent. No response from other PT boats. PT-119 was nothing but static, and PT-132 never answered at all. Rodriguez climbed up to the bridge, his face pale beneath the soot. "That was the last one," he said, his voice dry. 3 destroyers. Taylor nodded without speaking. His throat burned from smoke. He glanced at his shaking hand, noticing fresh splinters buried beneath the gauze. The sea breeze pressed into his face, cool but heavy with ash. They were still breathing, but just barely. The engines rattled as PT-117 limped toward open water, its hull battered and deck stained with oil and blood. Far behind them, the glow of the destroyed ships merged into a single band of fire stretching across the edge of the world, a graveyard of men and metal. The Pacific fell silent again, but it wasn't peace. It was that uneasy quiet that always comes just before the next storm. Daylight broke over the Solomon Islands with a pale, washed-out glow. Smoke still lingered along the horizon, hanging low like a shroud hiding the remains of the night's destruction. PT-117 crept into the calm shallows of a reef-protected cove, its hull groaning, seams puffed from salt water and shrapnel. Barnacles scraped against the keel as birds circled above, their sharp cries oddly out of place in the aftermath of fire and wreckage. Taylor's crew moved slowly, as if drifting through fog. No shouting, no urgency, just quiet repairs. Rodriguez's hands were raw and blistered from hours of pumping seawater out of the bilge. Miller rested in the shade, his leg wrapped in a bandage, lips too dry to form words. Taylor hadn't slept in more than 30 hours. His uniform was torn to shreds, skin scorched where flames had licked his arms. He stared blankly across the channel, one eye nearly swollen shut from smoke and exhaustion. At exactly 06:15, the radio spat a single burst of static, then fell quiet again. Taylor leaned closer, adjusted the frequency by touch, and caught a faint voice from a forward Coast Watcher station. The transmission was brief but unmistakable. Recon aircraft confirms 2 destroyers sunk. 3rd presumed destroyed. Wreckage drifting northeast. No U.S. craft reported in area. PT boat losses unknown. No one believed it. Naval headquarters logged the event as a possible submarine attack. Some speculated it was caused by mines. A few guessed torpedoes dropped from aircraft. Nobody in the rear lines could accept that a single PT boat had taken out not 1, but 3 Japanese destroyers in one night. The odds defied logic. The numbers were almost insulting. Taylor didn't explain. He transmitted his position and requested spare engine parts, medical support, and fresh torpedoes. When asked for further details, he offered nothing. The silence spoke for itself. By 09 Hunquak, 2 Marines paddled in on a dinghy, both silent, uniforms stained with old blood. They had been stranded inland for nearly a week and had seen the explosions from a ridge. One of them glanced out at the empty sea and muttered, "Figured you were dead, or ghosts." Taylor looked up and answered, "Both." Later that day, a PBY reconnaissance plane flew overhead, circling twice before turning northward. Its crew snapped photos of oil slicks, twisted hulls, and drifting corpses with a quiet precision that made the wreckage seem more like relics in a gallery than the remains of a wooden boat's impossible stand. When the prints reached headquarters, the intelligence officers sat in disbelief. The fragments matched known Imperial Japanese Navy destroyer designs. There was no longer any doubt. Someone had accomplished the unthinkable. The Navy responded by following procedure. Reports were locked down. Official accounts were revised. Taylor was summoned, not to receive a medal, but to be reassigned. His new role was clear: command a unit with operational freedom and no formal chain of oversight. The language was exact. He would act independently. No media, no backup, just orders. Behind closed doors, senior officers debated how to duplicate the feat. Technical crews requested access to PT-117. The request was denied. The boat was too damaged, too fragile. Taylor wouldn't allow anyone to touch her. "She's earned her rest," he told them. Instead, he handed over a grease-stained list of modifications scrawled in pencil across a torn chart. At the top, in smudged block letters, were 2 words: Ghost Glide. Within a fortnight, 6 more crews began training in silent drift tactics. Mechanics reworked exhaust systems. Camouflage painters altered hull colors to match the sea. Torpedo men rehearsed reloading in darkness without light. The doctrine remained unchanged, but the atmosphere shifted. The rules bent ever so slightly, enough for something different to take hold. PT-117, though bruised and battered, stayed afloat. With crude repairs and 2 new men replacing the lost, the boat was rearmed. 3 torpedoes, spare fuel barrels wired to the deck, and a flare pistol reloaded with stolen rounds. By the time the next full moon rose, they were back at sea. Same boat, same hands, but a different purpose. This time, they weren't the only ones. The sky faded to a deep gunmetal hue as dusk settled over Vela Gulf. Low clouds hovered thick and heavy, streaked with a dim, blood-orange glow that barely reached the surface of the water. Rain loomed in the distance, but never fell. Under that heavy sky, 4 PT boats slipped forward in formation, silent, dark, and nearly invisible against the waves. Taylor now commanded every one of them. Each boat carried 3 torpedoes, lacked radar, and shared a single memory: the events at Ferguson Passage. The crews had rehearsed night after night, practicing how to drift using only engine pulses, how to change heading without leaving a wake, how to feel vibrations through the soles of their feet. Their hulls were dulled with layers of soot and ash, their paint darkened with charcoal and oil-soaked rags. Flashlights were forbidden. Orders were passed silently. A squeeze of the hand, a tap of a finger. Even breathing was measured. Each man had committed the silent glide to muscle memory. Taylor stood at the helm of the lead boat. The salt wind had reopened his burns, but he wore no bandages. The pain kept him alert, awake. His chart, slick with sweat, outlined the curves of Vela Gulf. 2 reefs on the eastern side, a deep shelf on the western edge. They would strike in the one place where a destroyer couldn't turn quickly enough. Recon reported 3 Japanese vessels inbound, fast, heavily armed, meant to escort transports. Their goal was extraction, not engagement. But if the trap was discovered, the entire Gulf would ignite. Taylor had divided his boats into 2 groups. PT-117 and PT-134 would drift westward to block any retreat. PT-126 and PT-129 would strike from the front, fire once, then vanish. A single attack, no second chances. At a 114, contact was made. A faint glow on the horizon, then another. Twin smokestacks slicing through the dark. Japanese destroyers, right on schedule. The PT boats powered down. No wake, no voices, just the whisper of forward drift. Taylor crouched beside the torpedo cradle, adjusting the angle by sight. Rodriguez held a stopwatch, measuring distance. To his left, another boat signaled. Enemy now within 600 yards and closing fast. The sea was slick, glass-like, ideal for speed, ideal for ignition. PT-126 struck first. 1 torpedo slipped clean into the water, the release barely louder than breath. Then PT-129 launched. The destroyers responded too late. Their spotlights swung frantically, but all they caught was empty sea and starlight. The first detonation struck amidships, a clean, brutal hit. A fireball climbed into the air, backlighting the remaining vessels. Seconds later, the second torpedo hit its mark, tearing through the stern of the trailing destroyer and shredding its engine room. Sailors flung themselves overboard, their outlines flailing in a blur of smoke and fire. Sirens howled across the decks. Taylor's boat surged ahead 30 yards and released its torpedo. He didn't watch. He turned sharply to starboard, engines sputtering back to life. PT-134 swung in the opposite direction, spraying tracer rounds across the bridge of the nearest destroyer to blind its gunners. The final destroyer fired back. Erratic, wild, desperate. Rounds exploded around the fleeing boats, water erupting in columns like underwater mines. One shell caught PT-129 near the bow. The boat spun violently, cracked, then vanished into thick smoke. No distress signal, no voice on the radio. Taylor didn't stop. PT-117's torpedo hit the last destroyer just beneath the bridge. The result was immediate. Blinding force. The steel buckled. A geyser of water shot upward, then folded inward, dragging the deck down. The destroyer twisted violently, bow lifting as though in agony before rolling onto its side. The shockwave slammed into PT-117, throwing Taylor hard into the bulkhead. His shoulder struck first. The wheel snapped off in his hand. Sparks burst from the control panel. Rodriguez jumped to the controls, pushed the throttle forward, and steered around burning wreckage. He caught up to the remaining PT boat. Together, they weaved through the reef line, engines howling above the roar behind them. By 02:03, they'd cleared the Gulf. Only smoke remained in their wake. All 3 enemy ships were gone. Not limping, not burning, gone. Taylor looked over his shoulder once. The surface glowed with scattered firelight, broken and trembling like the ocean itself had caught flame. No one said a word. There were no cheers. Just quiet watching, slow drifting, and the silent knowledge that the next order could be their last. By sunrise, the smoke had thinned out, but the sea still shimmered with streaks of oil and scorched paint. Chunks of deck plating floated aimlessly like lifeless fish, blackened and still. The air was thick with the stench of burnt carbon, brine, and ruptured fuel. Gulls circled overhead but kept their distance. Even scavengers kept away. PT-117 drifted in idle, its hull creaking under its own weight. Taylor sat slumped against the engine hatch, legs outstretched, one hand pressed to his ribs. Something inside was broken. Maybe more than one thing. His uniform hung in tatters. Blood had soaked through his left sleeve and dried stiff across the canvas. He refused any talk of a tourniquet. Rodriguez knelt nearby, fastening a leaking fuel line using wire salvaged from a blown fuse panel. He worked quickly, but his hands trembled. Neither of them had spoken since the last destroyer went down. There wasn't anything left to say. Across the water, PT-134 leaned hard to starboard, half of its hull swallowed by the sea. 2 sailors waved from the deck. One had his jaw wrapped in bandages, the other stood barefoot, dazed. PT-129 had vanished without a warning. Just a burst, a sound, and silence. No signal, no struggle. Taylor finally pulled himself upright. Pain lanced through his side, but he swallowed it. He gave the order to ready the flare gun, then had it aimed west. A single red star cut through the morning sky. The reply came 20 minutes later. 2 small dots rising on the horizon, then 4. Patrol boats from a nearby outpost. Not rescue, just recovery. The crews that came said almost nothing. They treated the injured, carried the dead in tarps, and dropped dog tags into a rusted ammo tin. No one asked what had happened. The fire that lit the night had already told the story. Back at the base, Taylor disembarked under his own power. There was no speech as he handed over command of PT-117. His first request wasn't for medals or honors. He asked for a crate of spark plugs and a new drive shaft. He had work to do. The officers didn't get it. They didn't have to. Command wanted confirmation, numbers, evidence. Taylor gave them a hand-drawn map in charcoal, every strike marked with rough-range estimates and precise timing. He gave no explanations, no embellishments, just raw figures traced on salt-stained parchment. By week's end, the Navy filed the Vela Gulf action as the most effective PT boat operation of the Pacific Campaign. 3 destroyers destroyed. Few American casualties. No radar, no air support. Every torpedo launched by hand. The final report was labeled Unexpected result. Tactical reevaluation recommended. But privately, the Navy shifted course. Torpedomen began training in drift launch methods. Instruction manuals were updated with new attack patterns. Forward observers were told to start tracking enemy wake acoustics. Paint orders were changed. Light gray swapped out for blackout green. The shift spread quietly. It wasn't about recognition. It was about survival. The Japanese responded within days. Night operations were halted. Supply convoys were reduced. Fleet commanders redirected destroyers to cover Central Pacific routes. The Kolombangara losses had been too quick, too devastating. Rumors traveled, not of mines, not submarines, but of small American boats that appeared from nothing and left only fire behind. In Tokyo, an officer taken prisoner during the campaign whispered something that puzzled even the translators. His voice trembled, his eyes wide with fear. The ghosts. The burning ghosts in the black water. Taylor never heard the story. He was already gone. The last time anyone saw him in uniform, he was hunched over a torpedo tube, sleeves rolled to the elbow, sketching new firing angles in chalk. Behind him, PT-117 sat in dry dock, her hull wrapped in canvas, her name half-scorched and fading from the wood. She would never return to battle, but her legend already had. By September, rumors had replaced formal reports. Throughout the Solomon Islands, infantry patrols and signal operators spoke in hushed voices about ghost boats, silent, flame-shadowed phantoms that appeared from nowhere and left only devastation in their wake. Nothing was written down. Nothing was made official. But the tone had undeniably shifted. PT boat crews, once dismissed by fleet brass, now found themselves called into tactical meetings. Commanders asked how they managed to glide without wake, how they aimed by instinct, how torpedoes could hit targets without sonar support. Taylor's notes were shared in handwritten copies, never formally distributed. Most recipients never saw him in person. His name was absent from communiques. His missions weren't mentioned in official briefings. But somewhere at the top, something gave way. Within 60 days, a new entry appeared in the Pacific Fleet's Night Action Manual. It was buried deep in the appendix, a single footnote referencing low-noise passive glide for torpedo attack. It didn't cite Taylor. It didn't mention PT-117, but it confirmed that under certain conditions, drifting without power could be tactically effective. Unofficially, the technique spread far faster than any directive. Mechanics began altering valve systems on their own. Supply officers issued blacked-out tarps. Gunners practiced silent torpedo loading between missions. No one made speeches about the shift. It moved through the Navy like vapor, unnoticed but everywhere. Taylor left the base in October. No orders, no farewell. He boarded a supply vessel with a single duffel, a folded map, and a cracked compass tied to his belt with comms wire. His crew dissolved. Some were reassigned, some discharged, and a few simply disappeared. PT-117 remained in dry dock, her hull never fully repaired. No one dared dismantle her. Engineers came weekly to inspect the damage, measure structural stress, trace the scorching, and study the deep gash where a destroyer's blast had hurled steel through her deck. She never left port again, but at Nimitz's forward command, a canvas roll arrived, sealed tight and unmarked. Inside were hand-sketched diagrams, positions of ships during the Vela Gulf strike, estimated drift vectors, and torpedo impact arcs. The handwriting was Taylor's. There was no signature, no sender. The admiral said nothing, but 3 days later new orders were drafted. 5 PT squadrons reassigned for night interdiction across the Bismarck chain. They were issued extra torpedoes and customized mufflers. No radar, no flares, just blackout paint, patched wood, and silence. In Japan, analysts remained confused. Naval intelligence had anticipated submarine wolf packs, not wooden boats that disappeared with the moon. Reports from captured sailors repeated strange phrases: burning wind, ghost ships, silent cannons. One officer swore he saw a single craft, flagless, launch 3 torpedoes at once. He remembered seeing a grin in the darkness just before his ship broke apart. Command called it nonsense, but they quietly doubled destroyer escorts along key supply routes. In the Philippines, a young officer joining a PT flotilla was handed a torn field guide. One page was marked and dog-eared. It described an unauthorized maneuver, an engine-off drift attack navigated by stars. The officer asked who had come up with it. The chief engineer muttered the reply: "He didn't create it. He lived through it." There was no formal ceremony to mark the rise of Taylor's method. It wasn't official strategy. It was a whisper, passed from sailor to sailor who didn't care for credit, only survival. By the close of 1944, 7 Japanese destroyers had fallen to drift attacks across the Pacific. The tactic never made the news. The boats were never pictured on posters. The tales lived in barracks and beside campfires, told in quiet tones and always missing details. And at the end of every version came a single line. Never shouted, never explained. They did what Taylor did. And then, silence. In the closing months of the war, Taylor's name quietly vanished from personnel lists, field reports, and outgoing dispatches. No commendation, no photo in circulation, nothing in the newsletters mailed to families stateside. His disappearance didn't raise questions. It felt routine. The war surged onward, fast and massive, and men like Taylor were swallowed by its momentum. PT-1117, now disarmed, sat forgotten beneath a weather-stained canvas in a dockyard behind Tulagi. Her deck had split from heat fractures. Her bow drooped, still bearing the scars of unpatched damage. To engineers, she was just a relic. Sailors passed her by without pause. But sometimes at night, when the wind shifted and the lights went dark, a few swore they heard faint creaking from within her frame, like steps or voices too low to catch. One mechanic assigned to dismantle her refused to finish the job. He claimed the bulkhead radiated warmth, said the boards shifted underfoot even when untouched. He was reassigned. PT-117 remained where she was, untouched and ignored. Thousands of miles away, a man resembling Taylor rented a modest room near Puget Sound. No service awards on the wall, no family photos. He paid cash. The landlord remembered only this. Every morning before sunrise, the man walked alone down the pier, always pausing to look west across the water. He never wore the uniform again. At a small machine shop nearby, he repaired pumps and diesel components. He kept to himself. A long scar across his palm made it hard to grip tools, yet he never asked for assistance. Occasionally, as he worked over a crankshaft, he'd fall into stillness, lips moving faintly as if recalling something unseen in the dim shop light. No one ever interrupted him to ask. In 1952, a Navy historian arrived in Tulagi to record what remained of the wartime fleet for archival purposes. He captured 5 photographs of PT-117 from various angles. One photo showed her identification numbers. Faded, scorched, almost gone. The final report listed her as having an unverified combat history. No logbooks, no surviving action reports. That same year, in a bar in Okinawa, a former Japanese sailor spotted the boat's image printed in an English-language magazine. His hands trembled. Through a translator, he said he had seen that boat in 1943, seconds before his destroyer was ripped apart. His face went pale, and he repeated the same phrase, "Blackwater Ghost." The quote was never published. By then, Taylor's tactic had dissolved into the background. It was no longer called drift glide, just the silent approach. It spread quietly between schools and units, edited slightly with every version. The training manuals no longer credited any creator. No name, just diagrams and instructions. One document stored in the Naval War College archive, a memo from 1944, stayed classified for decades. Once released, a single sentence stood out amid the technical jargon. A commander had written that the drift method was not formally taught, only passed down. A war tactic born from urgency, not textbooks, refined by someone who understood what the ocean demanded. Years later, just outside that same machine shop in Puget Sound, a boy found an old plank nailed to a dock piling, weathered, splintered, dark with age. Letters burned faintly into its grain. Not a message, not a tribute, just a number. No initials followed, no explanation, just that number. The boy asked his father what it might mean. The man glanced at it and said, "Probably a boat, one that never made it home." Yet on certain nights, when the tide rolled in thick and still, the old dock creaked strangely, and far out beyond the reach of the shoreline lights, a faint silhouette would sometimes drift by. Low, quiet, never anchored, never sinking, sliding through the dark, and just as suddenly, gone.